Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear further evidence from people involved with the lifts at Grenfell Tower. Yes, Ms. Byer.
Can we call Mr. Jenchner, please?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Jenchner.
Good morning.
I understand you're going to make the affirmation.
I am.
And the words are there on the screen for you to read out, please.
Okay. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Would you like to sit down? Please make yourself comfortable. All right?
Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you. Yes, Ms. Byer, when you're ready.
Can you please give the inquiry your full name?
Warren Jenchner.
Thank you very much for coming to give evidence today and to assist the inquiry with its investigations. I will be asking you questions today. If you have difficulty understanding anything I am asking you, please ask me to repeat the question or I will put it in another way. If you feel you need a break at any point, just let us know. And finally, please can you keep your voice up so the transcribers can hear you?
I shall try.
You have made 2 witness statements for the inquiry. They are in a folder on your desk and will also appear on the screen. I'll take you.
Sorry, have you got the folder? You may not have one.
No, I haven't got the folder.
We use the screen most of the time, so we'll do that. Thank you.
I'll take you to the first one. It's at APX 408774. Is that your statement?
It is.
And can we go to the last page, please, page 19? And we can see there the date of the 29th of October 2019. And is that your signature?
It is.
And we don't need to go to it, but you've also provided a number of exhibits, 1 to 14. And for the transcript, there is an index of those at APX 408775. Your second statement, if we can go to that, at APX 408783. And again, is that your second statement?
It is.
And if we can go to the last page, 5, and we can see there that it's dated the 10th of December 2020, and is that your signature?
It is.
And have you read your statements recently?
I have.
And can you confirm that the contents of both are true?
They are.
And have you discussed your evidence with anyone before coming here today?
No.
Thank you. I'd like to now ask you a few questions about your employment background. Now, this is primarily set out in paragraphs 3 to 14 of your first witness statement, which we don't need to go to, but for the transcript, it's at APX 408774/1 through to page 3. Now, in summary, you enrolled at Woolwich College in 1982 on a 4-year apprenticeship for lift engineering.
That's right.
And you joined Apex, the family business, at the same time?
It is, yeah.
And you then finished your apprenticeship in 1985 and started as a repair and construction fitter.
That's right.
And you then worked your way up through various positions to become managing director in 1996.
That's right, yes.
And you also sit on the board for the Lift and Escalator Industry Association, which is known as LIA.
I do.
And is it right that you were president in 2008 to 9 and also in 2017?
That's right.
And in terms of your qualifications, you've completed the J5 and J26 modules, and these are lift engineer qualifications.
That's right, yes.
And you've also done distance learning courses from the National Association of Lift Makers, L1, L2, L3 and L4. Is that correct?
No, I haven't done distance learning.
Okay. Have you done any courses from the National Association of Lift Makers?
No.
And moving on to your relevant training, in your role as managing director, would you be expected to have knowledge of the principles and requirements of the relevant British and European standards which relate to lifts?
I have the knowledge, yes.
And in relation to firefighting lifts, did you undergo any training on the design requirements of a firefighting lift?
No formal training, although I sat in seminars regarding it.
And can you just give a bit more detail about the seminars that you attended in relation to firefighting lifts?
The seminars at the time were given by LIA, our trade association, so they would be a one-day seminar covering lots of topics.
So they'd cover lots of different topics, and one of those would be firefighting lifts?
It would, yes.
And included in that training or any other training, did you undergo any training on the types of buildings in which a firefighting lift would be required?
Yes, we covered that.
And did that training include training on the purposes and functions of a firefighting lift?
Yes.
And is it right that through your position on LEA, you're able to keep abreast of changes in the lift industry as well?
Yes. Yes.
Now, I'd like to move on to a couple of questions about Apex, the company. Is it correct that it was set up in 1970?
That's right.
And can you explain briefly what Apex does exactly?
We manufacture, install, maintain lifts and escalators.
And how do you ensure staff are keeping up to date with the latest developments in lifts, including British standards?
We supply the standards, and they go to seminars, again, given by LEA, and that's the only place that we know where the training can be given.
And moving on now to your previous high-rise experience. We don't need to go to it, but at paragraphs 10 to 12 of your first statement, that's at APX 8774/3, it's clear that Apex has undertaken a wide range of work. Is that correct?
That's right.
And prior to the Grenfell Tower project, what experience did you have of lift projects in high-rise residential buildings?
We installed lifts in Southwark, Lambeth, most London boroughs.
And did any of those projects involve an upgrade of a lift to the firefighting lift standards?
No, never.
Now, in your first witness statement, if we can go to it, it's APX 408774/13, and it's the answer to question 10D. So it's towards the bottom, and it's the last sentence of the penultimate paragraph. And it says, I cannot recall any instance where a request has been made or specification provided which requires the replacement of existing lifts in existing local authority buildings. And my question is, have you ever done a project in any type of building where there has been the replacement of an existing lift with a firefighting lift?
No, not changing a fireman's lift to a firefighting lift, no. Although we've installed firefighting lifts.
And is that an existing building?
Not changing the lift. If it was already a firefighting lift, then we put a firefighting lift back.
So just to be clear, that would be a building that already had a firefighting lift, and you would do a like-for-like replacement and keep it as a firefighting lift with new parts?
That's correct.
Mr. Jenchner, I get the impression from what you said here that local authorities don't, as a rule, want to upgrade lifts from fireman's lift to firefighting lifts. Is that the case?
That's correct.
And is there a particular reason for that?
I don't think most buildings would accommodate a full firefighting lift. So it would be too difficult because the electrical mains and serving all the floors, lots of changes would need to be invoked into that lift.
Yeah. Thank you.
If I can now move on to your previous relationship with RBKC, the TMO, and Butler & Young. Prior to the Grenfell Tower project, had you carried out any previous projects for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea?
For Kensington and Chelsea, yes.
And were any of those projects in high-rise residential buildings?
No, I don't believe so.
And can I take it from your previous answer that none of those included the upgrading of existing lifts to the firefighting lift standard?
No, none of them would.
And had you worked with the TMO prior to the Grenfell Tower project?
I don't believe so.
And through your work on the Grenfell Tower project, in your experience, did the staff at the TMO have professional lifts knowledge or not?
I only knew one of the staff, Robin Cahalarn, and I knew Robin Cahalarn prior to this job. He's been a lift engineer for many years, so I'd expect him to have knowledge.
And from your experience with Robin Cahalarn, was your experience that he did have knowledge of the relevant lift standards?
I don't know. I never asked.
And finally, had you worked with Butler & Young prior to the Grenfell Tower project?
Yes.
And were any of those projects in high-rise residential buildings?
Yes, possibly the Barbican.
And again, can I take it from your previous answer that it didn't include the upgrade of existing lifts to the firefighting lift standards?
No.
I'd now like to move on to a different topic, and that's the relevant standards relating to firefighting lifts.
Yeah.
Now, if we can go to your second statement, and that's at APX 408783/3. And I'd like to look at the answer to question 5 at the bottom of the page. And you state in that answer that the lifts at Grenfell Tower were not new lifts, that they were modernised lifts. And I'd just like to ask you to explain the basis of your view that they were modernised lifts and not new lifts.
It would have been industry practice at that time that the lifts would be modernised, and we kept 2 items of the existing lift.
And which were the 2 items that you kept?
It was the back boxes and the guides.
And so is it a fair summary of your view that because you kept those 2 items, therefore they were modernised lifts?
Yes, absolutely.
You state also on page 3, it's an answer to question 4, so it's just up the page a little bit. You note there in the second paragraph of your answer that EN 81.1 applied to the lifts. Is that a reference to EN 81.1 1998?
It is.
And is it correct that EN 81.1 1998 applies to new lifts only?
It does. That's reference to the products installed on the lift. So although the lift was installed to 5655, the products on that lift were CE marked and conformed to EN 81.1. So
just to clarify, and tell me if this is an incorrect summary of your answer, you agree that EN 81.1 1998 as a standard applies to new lifts, but what you're saying is that there were individual parts that were installed in the lift which complied with that standard because they were new parts, and that's what the reference there means.
Yes, it was an upgrade to 5655.
I'd now like to ask you to consider the view of the inquiry's expert. It's Mr. Howkins, and it's set out at paragraph 244 of his report, and that's at RHO 70/117, if we can go to that. And at paragraph 244, Mr. Howkins states that in his view, the lifts installed as part of Project 1 were new lifts, and that's because of the extent of replacement of parts. He says of particular importance is the fact that 1 set of car guide rails were relocated, 1 set of car guide rail fixings were replaced, and the counterweight frame and supporting brackets and associated fixings were new. Can I just ask if you agree with Mr. Howkins' view, and if not, can you explain why?
I don't agree it was a new lift. I agree with what he's saying, that these parts were replaced or moved.
But just to be clear, your view is that because some of the parts were retained on that basis, it wasn't a new lift. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'd now like to move on just to briefly discuss the requirements of a firefighting lift. In terms of what exactly was required...
I'm sorry, before we move on to the next topic, I don't know whether you've had a chance to read the whole of paragraph 244.
No, I didn't.
Perhaps you should have a chance to do that.
Yes.
I think what Mr. Howkins is saying as the basis for his view is that there are references in BS 5655 part 11 which treat a new lift as being installed where only the guide rails are retained.
Yes.
And you would not agree with that, is that right?
I wouldn't agree with it at the time that we were installing the lift, because it slightly changed in 2005.
Oh, right.
The industry standard was a new lift in a new building, or a new lift in a new building was a new lift.
Yeah.
And if you kept the guides, then it was accepted that it was an existing lift.
Right. And
that's an industry standard.
That was the prevailing view within the industry, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Spy.
So, Mr. Jenchner, if I can just further clarify that, is it your evidence that BS 565511 2005 in saying that retaining the guide rails but replacing all the other parts, in saying that that was a new lift, is your evidence that that was a change in the industry standards from what was previously the case?
It was, yes. Yeah.
And so, just to be clear, is it your evidence that had, for example, the project started in 2005 or 2006, that they would have been new lifts because only the guide rails were retained?
I don't think they would have been. The industry didn't do that. So just keeping the guides until now is still considered a refurbishment.
And can I just ask how you reconcile that with the definition of BS 565511 2005? We can go to it if that would help.
I can't.
If we can then move to the requirements of a firefighting lift. If we can go to your first statement at APX 408774/12 and look at the bottom half of that page. And there you have listed on the bottom half of that page, moving on to the next page, a number of requirements of a firefighting lift. I won't go through all of them, but would you agree that those requirements come from the following standards? BS 55885 1991, BS EN 8172 2003, and BS 55885 2004?
I would, yes.
And would you accept that these standards require a new building over 18 metres to have a firefighting lift installation?
I would.
And would you agree that the reasons for installing a firefighting lift in a new building would equally apply to an existing building?
No.
And can you explain the basis of that view?
An existing building wasn't designed to take a firefighting lift. So there's lots of differences between a new building and an existing building because it's a whole part of the standard. So the building is covered with stairwells and ventilation and auxiliary supplies.
If I can put to just, for one moment, just one side, the practicalities of installing a firefighting lift in an existing building. So if we can put that to one side for a moment. But in terms of the reasons why a firefighting lift is important in a building over 18 metres that's new, would you agree that those reasons would also apply to a building over 18 metres that is existing?
Yes, yeah.
So even though the standards don't directly say whether lifts installed in existing tall buildings should be upgraded to the standard of a firefighting lift, there would have been good safety-related reasons to upgrade the lifts to the full firefighting standard, insofar as it was reasonably practicable.
Only if it was the whole of the standard. So that's outside of our remit, really. So you're talking about ventilation on the landings, new mains, new substations. So that would be out of our design capabilities. And with these lifts, they didn't serve every floor, so you couldn't do it at Grenfell.
And just to be clear, when you say outside of your remit, do you mean that there were other aspects of BS 55885 which weren't to do with lifts, which you say had to be present for there to be a full firefighting lift upgrade?
Yes, these standards say building design standard, not necessarily a lift standard.
And finally, would you accept that if the lifts had been new lifts as opposed to modernised lifts in an existing building, should they have been firefighting lifts?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
So, sticking with the situation in which you have an existing building, but you have new lifts which are installed, would you accept that in that situation they should have been firefighting lifts?
No.
And can you just explain the reason for that?
Because the standard was for new buildings. It would be prudent to look at it, but the standard was actually for new buildings.
And when you say it would be prudent to look at it, can you just elaborate on that, please?
I think the designers should take it into consideration when installing a new lift, whether it's at all possible to have a full firefighting lift.
So it's something that the designers would consider in your view, and it depends on whether it's reasonably practicable or not.
It is, and Grenfell, it wasn't reasonably practical.
And on what basis do you say it wasn't reasonably practicable at Grenfell?
The biggest reason is the lift didn't serve every floor.
And on the basis of your understanding of the standards, was it necessary for the lift to serve every floor regardless of whether it was residential or not? So should the lift only serve residential floors, or did it have to serve every floor?
It says it shall serve every floor. I don't know what they mean by that really, but it shall serve every floor. And there's the reason for that is that the lift became stuck in the shaft. The distance between the floors, because it didn't serve every floor, was be too far to be able to rescue anyone from the lift. You wouldn't be able to get anyone out of the lift because the travel's too far.
Now, just moving on to the question, to another aspect of Mr. Howkins' report. If we can go to RHO 703/136. And it's paragraphs 303 to 304. And the question for you, Mr. Jenchner, is do you agree with Mr. Howkins that it would have been reasonably practicable to install at least some of the features of a firefighting lift? So in that particular paragraph, Mr. Howkins refers to a trap door, but there may have been other features of a firefighting lift that could have been installed.
No, it must be a whole firefighting lift. It can't be part of a firefighting lift.
But I think the question you're being asked to consider, Mr. Jenchner, is would it have been possible as a matter of engineering, if you like, to include a trapdoor in the roof of the new lift cars?
Yes, it's possible.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's really all that's being asked.
Okay.
I understand I think your position is you either do the whole job or you don't do any of it.
That's right, and particularly with the trapdoor, you wouldn't put that in a local authority building.
No.
Because the whole reason for having vandal-resistant lifts is to stop people getting on top of the lift.
Yes, but it could have been done, though no one would have wanted to do it.
No.
Yes, I see. Thank you.
And just to confirm, you would therefore disagree with the view of Mr. Howkins, which is set out at page 110 of his report. If we can just go to that, it's paragraphs 213 to 215. And in that part of his report, and I'll summarise, he sets out the view that although there was no standard which clearly answered the question whether existing firemen's lifts in tall buildings should be modernised to the full firefighting standard, in the context of a large project which provided the opportunity to upgrade the lifts to the firefighting standard, it would have been good industry practice to have considered upgrading at least some of the firefighting features of the lifts. So just to confirm, would you disagree with that view, and can you just clarify as to why?
I disagree with that, because it gives the fire brigade or anyone rescuing anyone a full sense of security. If there was a trapdoor, if there was drainage, they would think it was a full firefighting lift.
So you'd agree that the proper approach is either a full fireman's lift as to the previous standard or a full firefighting lift, and there's no, it's either it's an all or nothing approach, as it were.
That's right. It's an industry recognised approach.
And if we can now move on to a different topic, which is your role in the project at Grenfell Tower. If we can go to APX 405619. And this is exhibit number 2 to your statement, and it's headed contract documentation. Can you just explain who drafted this document and exactly who the contract was between in relation to the project?
I believe Butler and Young drafted the contract, only because it says so. And it's between the Royal Borough, Kensington, Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation and Apex.
So just to be clear, the contract was between yourselves and RBKC.
It was.
Did you have a contract with Butler and Young as well, or not?
No contract.
And was that ordinary practice in the industry at the time?
Yes.
And can you just briefly explain the division of roles and responsibilities between Butler and Young and Apex on this project?
Butler and Young were the specifiers of the lift, so designers, and would manage the site. And Apex were the installation company.
Now, just moving on to discuss the specification. In your first statement, we don't need to go to it, but it's at APX 408774/5. You note that the specification was extremely detailed, which was usual for Butler and Young. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at the time, did you review the specification personally?
No.
And can you just explain why you wouldn't have reviewed the specification personally?
We employ a sales team and construction director. I wouldn't review.
And in your second statement, if we can go to that at APX 408783/2, and it's the third paragraph, and that states that once awarded the contract, site meetings would be held prior to the project starting, and any issues could have been raised with Butler and Young at this time. But given the passage of time and lack of documentation, you can't assist in advising whether any concerns were raised, and if they were, the nature of those concerns. And if we can go to the next page as well, and at the first paragraph, and you say again that if Apex had concerns, they could have been raised with Butler and Young, and as a result, any concerns could have been aired with all those attending the pre-start meetings. And so my question really is, if Apex had taken the view that firefighting lifts were required, would it have been possible for them to have raised the issue with Butler and Young during the project?
Yes.
And in general, if Apex had had any safety concerns of any kind, it would have been possible for them to have raised that issue with Butler and Young?
It would have been, yes.
And in your experience, have you or other Apex colleagues ever had cause to do that in a project?
When you say safety, you're saying the design as a safety? No.
The inquiry had evidence from Ian Morehouse to the effect that the TMO provided a specific instruction to Butler and Young not to consider the feasibility of installing firefighting lifts at Grenfell Tower. Were you aware of this instruction from the TMO to Butler and Young?
No.
So in light of the fact that you hadn't been told about this instruction, do you agree or disagree that Apex, as the lift contractor, ought to have at least raised the issue of whether the lifts should have been firefighting lifts or not, or at least have some of the features of a firefighting lift?
I don't believe you can put a lift in with some of the features, and we wouldn't have raised or couldn't raise due to the specification that the lift required to be a firefighting lift.
And when you say couldn't raise, do you mean that it was the wrong time of the project to raise it, or that the specification had already been done and therefore it was too late?
Both. It's the wrong time, but we wouldn't consider the lift needed to be firefighting, so we wouldn't raise it. The specification was already written, and we were working to that specification. It's pre-start. We've already signed a contract.
If we can then move to Project One itself and how the project went, can you describe what, if any, involvement you had in the remainder of Project One?
No, just an overview. If there was problems, they would come to me.
And were there any problems during the course of Project One?
I think we were late in completing the works.
And is it possible, can you just elaborate a bit on why you were late in finishing the works?
I believe it was we hadn't allowed enough time for scaffolding and such like. We were working to the Butler and Young's programme. That wasn't our programme, so I believe the programme was too short.
Thank you, Mr. Jenchner. I've come to the end of my prepared questions.
So you'd like a bit of time just to
Yes,
check
Mr.
up?
Chairman, thank you.
Well, Mr. Jenchner, when Council gets to the end of her prepared questions, we always have a short break, partly to enable her to check she hasn't overlooked anything, and partly to enable those who are following the proceedings but not in the room to suggest other questions that perhaps we ought to ask you. So we're going to have a break now. We'll come back at 10:45, and at that point we'll see whether there are any more questions we need to put to you.
Okay, thank you.
I have to ask you please not to talk to anyone about your evidence during the break.
Okay.
And if you go with the usher, she'll look after you. We'll see you in a few minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good. Thank you very much. 10:45, please. Then could we have Mr. Jenchner back in, please, if he's there? Right, Mr. Jenchner, well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Okay. Yes, Ms. Bahe?
No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Jenchner, I think at this stage it's right that I should thank you very much for coming here to give your evidence. We haven't detained you very long, for which no doubt you're profoundly grateful. But it has been very helpful to us to hear what you have to tell us, and very useful. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And you are now free to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Bahe. Now, we do have another witness, but we'll have to have a short break, shan't we, so that arrangements are made for changeover?
Yes.
Good. All right. Well, I think that what we'll say is we'll take a break, and you can ask the usher to come and get us when you're ready for the next witness. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear. Now we have another witness. Is
We
that
do.
right?
So, Mayor called Robin Cahalarn.
Yes. Before you do, can I just say the morning's been a bit fragmented for perfectly understandable reasons. I don't think we want to have another break at 11:15, do we?
We don't.
But I don't think Mr. Cahalarn wants to go for 2 hours unbroken. So perhaps we could look for a suitable time, perhaps nearer 12 o'clock, depending on.
I had noon in mind, sir, as a time.
Sounds very sensible. Yes. All right. Thank you very much. Yes. Now you're going to call.
Robin Cahalarn.
Yes. Thank you very much. Good. Good morning, Mr. Cahalarn.
Good morning, Cahalarn, yes.
Yes.
Silent H.
Good. Thank you very much. Now, I understand you're going to make the oath, so there should be a testament on the desk there. Could you take it in your right hand and repeat the words on the screen, please?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I should give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, do sit down and make yourself
Thank you.
comfortable there. Right. Yes, Mr. Kinnear, when you're ready.
Thanks, sir. Would you please confirm your name for the record?
Robin Cahalarn.
Mr. Cahalarn, thank you very much for attending today. Before we start your evidence today, I should make clear 3 points. First of all, if at any stage you require a break, please say so. That's not a problem. Secondly, if at any stage my questions are unclear or too long, please say so, and I'll try and rectify matters. Thirdly, if you could keep your voice up whilst giving evidence, that allows the shorthand writer to catch everything and to catch everything you say accurately. Also, one final word of advice is don't nod as a substitute for yes or no. Just say yes or
Okay,
no,
yes.
as the case may be.
Well, you can nod if you want to, but you have to say yes as well.
Did a yes with the nod.
That'll do. Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Cahalarn, you provided 2 statements to this inquiry. The first one can be found at TMO 008666023, and it's dated the 7th of January 2020. Is that yours?
Yes.
The second statement is dated the 8th of October 2020 and can be found at TMO 00879767. Is that your second statement?
Yes,
Have you read those statements recently?
I have.
And are their contents true?
They are.
Thank you. Now, if we could first turn to background matters in relation to your employment. Now, in summary, is it right that you began training as a lift engineer for Lift Express in 1969?
Express lifts, yes.
And after leaving Express Lifts, you joined the London Borough of Wandsworth as a lift inspector for 3 years.
Yes.
And you then joined RBKC in or about 1990 as a lift engineer.
Yes.
When did your employment transfer to the TMO?
Can't remember the actual date. It wasn't a ceremony of any sort, it just happened.
But during your time there, you were promoted to senior lift engineer, is that right?
At the end, I gained the title, but just gained the title. It didn't make any difference to my job at all.
Thank you. And during your time at the TMO, were you generally line managed by David Steppel?
All the time, yes.
And after he left, you were line managed by Keith Fifield, the senior electrical engineer, followed by Ricky Sams, is that right?
Yes.
And is it right that you left the TMO in or about August 2013?
I left when I was 65, December 2012.
December 2012. Thank you. Now, if we could go to your job description, which can be found at TMO 008666024. Now, you say in your statement, your first statement, paragraph 10, that this job description was provided from later in your employment at the TMO. Is that right?
Yes.
And just to confirm an answer you gave earlier on, there was no substantive difference between what your job entailed before this job description was provided and after.
That's correct.
Now, if we could go to TMO 008666026. As you can see, this is a handwritten document showing the division of responsibilities between yourself, which I think is summarised from page 3 onwards, as lift engineer, and Mr. Steppel, whose role can be seen from page 1 and 2. So if we go back. First of all, is that a correct summary?
They are my handwritten summaries, and they are, yes.
And why did you write down those hand?
I must have been asked at some point to give give that summary. I don't know. We were going through lots of different consultants were coming along to the TMO and looking at our job descriptions and so on, what we actually did with regard to pruning back on staff, actually, which is why I was made redundant, I believe, at the end of the process.
And can you remember the date of this document?
No idea.
Would it provide an accurate summary of your responsibilities and roles in 2003, 2004, for example?
Broadly, yes. I wouldn't be developing policies and procedures. I'd do that along with Dave Steppel, my line manager.
Now, can I turn to a separate but related topic of training and knowledge of requisite standards? What qualifications do you have in relation to lift engineering?
None.
Focusing on your time at KCTMO, how often would you attend training or education courses that were concerned with the relevant standards that applied to lifts?
None whatsoever.
Did you receive any training outside work on the requirements of British or European standards?
No.
Now, if we can go to TMO 008666024/3, and again, this is your job description, the typed version of it. And if we look at the third entry from the bottom of the page, it says this: generally keep abreast of all developments in lift design and operation, British Standard Code of Practice legislation relating to lifts and hoists. Now, if you were given no training by your employers, how did you generally keep abreast of those developments?
We received notifications from the lift contractors, independent lift services and Otis lifts, and we had a magazine, a monthly magazine called Elevation, which kept us up to scratch with different occurrences that were going on with the lift industry. We had a very substantial library of British standards that we could refer to at any time.
So is it fair to say that, for example, whilst you may have received no training on the principles and requirements of BS 5588591, you're nonetheless familiar with its requirements?
No, I wouldn't be, no.
Were you aware of the existence of that standard?
No, I wasn't.
Would you have had documents such as that in your library of documents that related to lifts?
The library was pretty substantial. It was kept up to date. I can remember myself going to the company that issued the documents at the end of Chiswick High Road to go along and get different British standards on more than one occasion. We had an account with them, the BSI in Chiswick High Road, yes.
And so you would have, on occasion, reason to consult the substance of British standards?
If need be, but my job purely was service and maintenance, and I was quite well up on that, BS 5655, through my time in the lift industry for the 25 years, yes.
So, again, just going back, you said there that I was quite well up on BS 5655. I asked you earlier whether you were nonetheless familiar with its requirements. What is the correct position?
Yes, I was familiar with its requirements.
Now, were you aware of next BS EN 8172 from 2003, which is entitled Safety Rules for the Construction and Installation of Lifts, Particular Applications for Passenger and Goods Passenger Lifts, Firefighter Lifts?
I've heard of it, and it was there for me to look up if I needed, but I didn't particularly have good knowledge of it, no.
Can you just help me with this? You obviously had a pretty large library of things you could go and consult, but what would lead you to go and consult the library?
If I was asked a specific question, or if it came up at a meeting, that sort of thing, but really I didn't have to go to it that often, to be honest with you.
Thank you very much.
Were you aware of the change to BS 5588591 that was brought in November 2004?
No.
Did you have any reason to consult the substance of the revised
No.
requirements?
No.
Is it fair to say, therefore, that you weren't familiar with the substance of those revisions?
It's fair to say that, yes.
Are you aware of a document called Approved Document B?
No.
Have you ever heard anyone in the lifts context that you had to deal with during your time at the TMO refer to Approved Document B?
No.
Just to clarify matters on one particular detail we'll come on to later on, in relation to firefighting lifts, were you aware of what was required in order to properly classify a lift as a firefighting lift?
At the time, I had very little knowledge of it, so no is the answer. Subsequently, I've gained more information, especially in the last 2 weeks.
Would you have deferred to others, including David Steppel, as to the precise requirements of the relevant standards?
Would I to refer to him?
Would you defer to him?
Yes, David Steppel handled all the lift refurbishments. He was the next installation engineer. I was a service and maintenance engineer.
Now, can I turn to a separate topic, which is your experience of high-rise residential buildings and lifts serving such buildings? Before the Grenfell Tower project in 2003, what experience did you have of lift projects in high-rise residential buildings?
We had several lifts, in fact, maybe 20 or 30 lifts refurbished throughout the borough in the time I was there. The Wells End Estate, Chelsea, they were high-rise. Silchester Estate, they were high-rise. There were quite a lot of high-rise refurbishments.
Did any of those projects involve upgrading lifts in an existing building to firefighting lifts?
No,
None of them.
none of them.
Can you help us, out of the TMO stock, how many high-rise residential buildings were fitted with firefighting lifts in 2003-04?
None.
When you left in 2012, was the position the same?
Yes.
Now, before this project, had you worked with Butler & Young before?
Not off the top of my head. As I say, I was purely there for the maintenance and servicing, so Butler & Young were the consultants used in refurbishments.
Now, had you worked with Apex, mindful of the answer you've just given, had you worked with Apex before you started work on the Grenfell project?
For Wandsworth Council, yes.
And did any of those projects involve high-rise buildings?
No. Oh, yes. Sorry. I thought you were. Sorry.
And just one, was it?
No, there would have been more high-rise buildings. I thought you were asking the question about firefighting lifts. Sorry, I jumped the gun and didn't listen.
Can we turn on to firefighting lift standards? And if we could just see what the standards required and see how far we go. Now, you indicated in your first witness statement, we don't need to go to it, but it's at paragraph 4, and the reference is TMO 008666023/1, that it's been some 7 years since you had anything to do with lifts or lift regulations. Now, can I assume that you haven't had any need to consult any lift standards since you retired?
That's correct.
Now, mindful of that, can we just go to some documents and see what your knowledge was? It may be that you haven't seen the documents before, but I want to understand your knowledge of the underlying requirements. Could we go to Approved Document B, the 2000 version, which can be found at BRE /5391/110. And we see there on the right-hand side towards the bottom, section 18.11. And I'll just let you briefly read that, Mr. Cahalarn. Now, that states that firefighting shafts should be designed, constructed and installed in accordance with the recommendations of BS 55885 1991. First of all, were you familiar with that statement of principle?
No.
Can I now turn to a separate standard, which is BS 55885 1991 itself, which can be found at BSI /0001721. Now, there we go. That's the front page. Now, this is the version published in August 1991. It's the one you said you had some, if I put it, familiarity and working knowledge of. If we can go to page 10 within this
I
document.
said 5655, not 5855.
Apologise. But first of all, are you familiar with this standard?
No, I'm not.
No. Can we go to page 10, mindful of that, and in particular part 3.6, which is at the bottom right-hand corner. And it says there, the criteria for the provision and number of firefighting shafts in many building types are given either in building regulations or in the relevant part of BS 5588. However, where no such guidance is available, the provision and number of firefighting shafts should be based on the following. A, buildings or parts of buildings where 1, the height of the surface of the floor of the topmost storey, excluding any storey consisting exclusively of plant rooms, exceeds 15 metres. Were you aware of that provision?
At the time, no.
Looking at it, would you agree with me that at least according to this, if a new building is built, the advice is that it should have a firefighting shaft, which would include a firefighting lift?
Yes.
Could we go to next, BS EN 8172, 2003, which concerns safety rules for the construction and installation of lifts, particular applications for passenger and goods passenger lifts. That can be found at BSI *0 1725. Now, as you can see, this was published in, we see from page 2 certainly, this was published in July 2003. If we can go to page 7 within this document, we can see in the top its definition of scope, and clause 1.2 sets out those circumstances in which the standard is not applicable, and what it says there is that it does not apply to lifts, at the second dash point, lifts installed in existing buildings, or to important modifications to existing lifts installed before the publication of this standard. But there's a caveat at the end which says this, however, this standard may usefully be used as a basis. First of all, were you aware of that provision?
I wasn't aware at the time.
And when you say you weren't aware at the time, is that during the course of your employment by the TMO?
The document was there. I've seen the document, the document before. Yes, I have.
Now,
Couldn't read it out by heart, but yes, I've seen that document before.
Looking at what it says in 1.2, in particular the last sentence, would you agree that this standard could provide a basis for the design requirements of a firefighting lift, if required, to an existing building?
I wouldn't have any view on that. It's not something that I would have dealt with in the past. That would be Mr. Steppel.
Now, we were discussing this slightly earlier on, but could we go to BS 5588-5, 2004, fire precautions in the design and construction of use of buildings, access and facilities for firefighting, and that can be found at BSI *0 1723. Now, this was published, and we can see from page 2, but we need to go to it, don't need to go to it. This was published in November 2004, by which time the lift project at Grenfell had started. And if we can go to page 18 in this document, and the bottom of the page there at clause 7, and you'll see under the heading firefighting facilities, there's the subheading firefighting shafts, and then the subheading, which is provision of firefighting shafts. And it says this: firefighting shafts should be provided in tall buildings, buildings with deep basements, and buildings with large floor areas. And if we can go over the page to table 4, and we see the top left-hand row, it says this: buildings or parts of buildings where the height of the surface of the floor of the topmost storey, excluding any storey consisting entirely of plant rooms, exceeds 18 metres, should be provided with firefighting stair, firefighting lobbies, provided with a fire main, firefighting lift installation. Now, looking at what is set out there in clause 7 and in table 4, would you agree that it's clear, at least from this standard, that new tall buildings, i.e. buildings over 18 metres, should have a firefighting lift?
New buildings, yes.
And that, would you accept that the rationale for having firefighting lifts is to facilitate firefighting efforts in the event of a fire?
Yes.
And that would be the reason for having such lifts and firefighting shafts in new buildings?
Yes.
And the safety rationale for having firefighting lifts in new buildings, at least in principle, applies equally to existing buildings. Would you accept that proposition?
I wouldn't. The new buildings would be structurally made for the firefighting lifts to be installed within it. It may not fit into the old buildings for all sorts of reasons.
And in that regard, you'd look at structural constraints.
Yes.
And what would structural constraints involve?
Evacuation areas, a reason for a way of the water ingress leaving the lift shaft, the secondary power supply. That's about it, really.
Now, just following on from those answers, if we can look at what features a firefighting lift would have, and then we can discuss in further detail whether they were considered at Grenfell. Now, the standards require, would you agree with me, a lift car that has certain dimensions, material of limited combustibility, and must run its course in 1 minute?
I don't understand the question.
No, you won't see the answer there,
Okay.
Mr. Cahalarn, if you just listen to the
Yeah.
question asked. In order to be classified as a firefighting lift, lift has to have a number of features. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Now, if we can start off with the first one, which concerns the lift car, and would you accept that the lift car has to have certain dimensions, material of limited combustibility, and complete its course in under 1 minute?
I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware of the requirement for it to have a lift car trapdoor?
I am aware of that.
Water protection, are you aware of that
I'm
requirement?
aware of that one.
And that protect the installation from water which might enter during firefighting
I'm aware of that, yes.
and that you're aware of the requirement for it to have a fire control switch and associated system to bring the lift under firefighters' control?
Yes.
Are you aware of the requirement for it to have a fire service communication system?
Yes.
And finally, a secondary power supply?
Yes.
Now, at paragraph 36 of your first statement, and we don't need to go to it, but the reference is TMO 00866023/4, you state that the concept of a firefighting lift did not come into force until 2015. Now, do you accept that at least the concept of a firefighting lift was dealt with in standards certainly from at least 1991?
When I was asked to make the statement, I haven't been to work for nearly 9 years. And instead of just putting no to every single thing in the statement, I thought I would openly try to help the inquiry. And I looked it up on the internet, and the only time I can see was 2015. I wasn't aware of any of that, and it was an overstatement. I didn't know you were going to employ a lift expert or someone to come along, so I was really trying to help the inquiry, to
Mr.
be
Cahalarn,
honest.
we're grateful for that, but the question was, would you accept, I've taken you to BS 55885 1991. You said you had some familiarity with it. That obviously deals with firefighting lifts. Would you accept that at least the concept of a firefighting lift was dealt with in standards from 1991?
In retrospect, yes.
Thank you. Now, in the view of the inquiry's expert, Mr. Howkins, he summarised his view at paragraph 248 of his report, and if we can go to RHO 00003/118. Now, he says there, and you'll see in the first line this: regardless of whether the lifts were considered new or modernised, good practice would have been to consider if the lifts could be fully upgraded to the firefighting standard, so far as was reasonably practicable. Are you able to agree or disagree with that statement?
I have no comment. I'm sure Mr. Howkins must be right, but I had no involvement in that. That wasn't my part of the contract. It was just for servicing and maintenance, and I wouldn't be aware of what was required.
Well, mindful of that, if we can just go to paragraph 22 of one of your statements, which can be found at TMO 008666023/3. And if we go to paragraph 22 in the second line, you say this: at the time, the industry view was that a fireman's lift was a perfectly appropriate lift for a building which should have compartmentation. To the best of my knowledge, the specification was always to require lifts to comply with British Standard 5655. Now, was that view based on your experience, or was it based on a reading of the relevant standards?
My experience.
Now, can I ask you specifically about questions about the fire control switch? And if we can go to BSI quadruple 01728, and this hopefully should be another British standard, which concerns engineering and safety features to be incorporated when modernising electric lifts. And if we can go to page 6, and we see at the top, this is concerned with modernisation by altering of existing installations. What this paragraph says at the very top left-hand corner, it says this: where the controller of a fireman's lift is changed, the control system should comply with BS 5588 Part 5. Now, to the lay eye, that looks as if the new fire control system should comply with 55885. Would you agree with that?
It looks like it, yes.
And that applies regardless of whether the works are a modernisation or an installation of a new lift?
From that, what it says there, yes, I agree with that.
Now, can I turn on to a separate topic now, and that's the TMO's own lift standards that are applied. And if I could ask you, first of all, to go to Mr. Ian Morehouse's second statement, which can be found at BUT quadruple 00054/5. And we can go to paragraph 12 at the bottom of that page. And he says, 3 lines up from the bottom, this: I was aware from other projects that David, so that's David Steppel, had developed the KCTMO's lift strategy, such as determining which lifts were most in need of modernisation, and that he had developed the KCTMO's own lift standards, although I never saw them. Now, first of all, did KCTMO have its own lift standards?
No.
Bearing in mind that answer, do you have any educated assessment of what Mr. Morehouse might have been thinking when he referred to KCTMO's own lift standards there?
We had an ongoing 25-year refurbishment policy, depending on the age of the lift and the usage of the lift, and those lifts were renewed going through.
So your understanding was there was a strategy document?
Specifically, yes.
But you weren't aware of
standard.
any specific standards that applied to the type of classification of lifts to be installed in TMO buildings?
Yes.
Now, just to sort of bottom out this point, and just to have the benefit of your view on it, could I ask us to go to paragraph 19 in this statement, which is at page 7. And if we look really at the second sentence, which starts on the second line, Mr. Morehouse says, in relation to a particular element of the brief, the section also stated that firefighting and evacuation lift requirements shall be addressed. Section 10 is headed New Installation General Requirements. It was my understanding, so this is Mr. Morehouse, that this Section 10 reflected KCTMO's lift standards at that time, and there was no reference at all to firefighting lifts in this Section 10. Now, having regard to what Mr. Morehouse says there, are you able to assist again as to whether there were any particular standards applied by Mr. Steppel?
No.
Now, can I turn to the project itself and, first of all, the drafting of the project brief? And could I go to, first of all, TMO 00853-783, and in particular page 2. There we go, we have the front page, which is the project brief for consultants for the Project 1. First of all, do you recognise that document?
No.
Can you help us as to who drafted the project brief for Project 1?
That would be Mr. Steppel.
Did you have any involvement in that process?
No.
Do you know if anyone else had any involvement in the drafting of the project brief?
I don't know.
Now, could we go to page 5 in this document? And you will see in paragraph 1.5, the The first entry is other council personnel under roles and responsibilities, and it's got technical services TMO contact Robin Cahalarn, senior lift engineer. First of all, were you aware that you were in fact a TMO contact for the project, or at least one of them?
I was aware relative to the servicing and maintenance, as I've already stated.
Now, we don't need to go to them, but in paragraphs 15 and 18 of your first statement, and the reference can be found at TMO 008666023/2, you refer to you yourself being aware, quotes, of the first project. Now, given that you're identified as a contact here, that tends to suggest that your involvement was more substantive than mere awareness. Would you accept that?
Yes, I'd accept that, yes.
Now, if we can look at the requirements of the brief itself, and if we could go to page 12 within this document, and then we have clause 1.1 under the heading Client Requirements, and we've looked at this with a number of the other lift witnesses both this week and last week, and it says this: the Tenant Management Organisation, TMO, and the Lancaster West Estate Management Board, EMB, require a condition and feasibility report on the 2 traction passenger lifts serving Grenfell Tower and the single hydraulic passenger lift serving the adjacent offices. Now, the next sentence of the first paragraph says this: the report shall address the client's concerns in respect to the immediate and medium-term maintenance viability of the existing installations, given the current level of failures, availability of replacement parts, compliance to latest British standards, and energy conservation. Now, looking at that last part of that sentence, which refers to addressing compliance with British standards, was the TMO's expectation that the feasibility report would address compliance of the new lifts with British standards?
That's what it says. I wasn't particularly aware of that. As I said, I was involved with the lifts breaking down, the failures and the unavailability of parts.
I should have asked this, perhaps in fairness to you, but do you remember being provided with a copy of the project brief back in 2003?
No, not off the top of my head.
No. Would you have been provided with this type of document before work started on lift projects?
No.
In those circumstances, how would you know what works were to be carried out?
Mr. Stepple would tell me when the works were carried out, yeah.
So you wouldn't see the specification either?
I did see the specification for Grenfell Tower to give comments relative to maintenance and servicing, yes.
And confined to that limited issue of service and maintenance?
I would have seen the specification, but I wouldn't have commented on that. That wasn't my expertise.
Now, could I go to page 17 in this document? And it's the section 10 that we were just looking at previously, which Mr. Morehouse understood to reflect what he understood to be TMO internal standards. And you'll see, if we can go to 10.23 on this page. There we go with the page. There needs to be a fireman's switch at the ground floor. And if we drop down to 10.26, it says that landing doors and fireman's switch are to be operated by express anti-vandal drop keys. Now, both of those were specified as part of this project brief. Were you aware of those requirements at all before or during the work?
It looks like the things that we would have done in the lift refurbishment to our lift cars. I don't remember the exact document, but I would imagine that would have gone along with the brief to say what was required, yes.
Now, if we can put the project brief to one side and consider something different but related, and that's an instruction from David Stepple that the Apex witnesses referred to last week, and the Butler and Young, rather, witnesses referred to last week. Now, both Mr. Ellis and Mr. Morehouse said that David Stepple specifically instructed them not to consider the issue of firefighting lifts in the feasibility study. Do you remember such an instruction being referred to by Mr. Stepple?
No.
Were you aware of any such instruction?
No.
Do you recall any discussion with Mr. Steppel about firefighting lifts and whether it would be a good idea to have them, not to have them?
No.
That was my next question. Do you know, or are you aware of any reasons that might have led Mr. Steppel to have given such an instruction?
No.
Would you have been consulted on such matters by Mr. Steppel?
No.
Do you remember him discussing any concerns about costs in relation to what type of lift was to be installed at Grenfell?
No.
Do you remember Mr. Steppel raising any concerns about structural, environmental or other practical issues which may limit or define the type of lift that could be installed at Grenfell?
No.
Were you involved in consideration of the risks of not installing a firefighting lift, put differently? No. Now, a slightly related issue. In your first statement, you stated at paragraph 40, which can be found at TMO 008666023/5, we don't need to go to it, that you estimated the cost of upgrading the lifts to firefighting lifts to be around £10,000 per lift. Can you help us how you reached that figure?
I'll have a go, yeah? I did write it down yesterday, but I wasn't allowed to bring papers with me. That was following a conversation, I believe, with Janice Ray and the guy who was doing the fire risk assessment. And I said it would be £10,000 per lift or more. I thought that the secondary supply would be £2,000. The roof trap would be £500. The covering within the lift shaft, taking into consideration that the landing locks are covered, the top of the lift car equipment is already covered, I allowed another £1,000 for that. I allowed for a pit pump, and I allowed for the landing intercom system, which I made about £9,000. But I was never asked to carry out a full feasibility. If I did, I think it may have been nearer to 15,000, 16,000 relative to the secondary supply. And if we needed to take the water away from the lift pit, then there would be building works involved, taking it out to the outside of the building. So in retrospect, I was a little bit low there, but that was just a ballpark figure.
Mr. Ellis referred to a figure of between £70,000 and £100,000 for both lifts. What would be your response to that estimate?
I think Mr. Ellis is the lift consultant, and he may well have done this before and would be more likely to be right than I was.
So you defer to him in that respect?
But I would have gone to him to carry out the feasibility report in the end, and he would have come back and said, look, your figure's too low. But that is the figure that I reached, and I reached that by what I thought was around those ballpark figures at that time. But it wasn't a full feasibility report, and it was around 10,000 per lift. So we're saying 25,000, whereas he says 70, yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Now, can we look at what the first project involved, and can we look at sort of the detail and see whether we agree on what it involved? First of all, it involved an increase in lift capacity from 8 to 12 people. Is that right?
Yes.
And an increase of lift speed?
Yes.
And it required the replacement of the following components. And if I go through them and you say yes or no, as your memory suggests. First of all, a complete new lift car.
Yes.
Replacement of a complete lift car, I should say.
Yes.
Replacement of the counterweight.
Yes.
Replacement of the car sling and platform.
With the counterweight, I'm not 100% certain on that, but I have listened to the previous guys who've given. I thought they may have reused parts of the counterweight, but I'm most likely wrong on that. That's just me guessing. So I'd say yes, the counterweight.
Subject to that caveat you've given.
Yes.
The car sling and platform.
Yes.
Safety gear.
Yes.
Door operator.
Yes.
Car doors.
Yes.
Landing doors.
Yes.
Landing control system.
Yes.
Landing pit buffers.
Yes.
Electrical wiring.
Yes.
Lift controller.
Yes.
And the lift motor gearbox.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, if we go to the specification, which is at BUT 0000044 2020/12. And clause 1.3.1 at the top. Now, this summarises what was intended to be retained in the two electrical passenger lifts. First of all, the guides and single rise of the car guide brackets, and secondly, the landing back boxes. Does that reflect your recollection of what was actually retained?
Yes.
Now, the evidence from last week was that whilst the car guides were retained, they were in fact relocated. Does that accord with your memory as well?
Yes.
Now, in your statement at paragraph 7, this is your first statement at paragraph 27, I should say, and we don't need to go to it, but the reference is at TMO 00866023/3. You stated that the crown bar and car frame were retained. Now, on fuller reflection, and my having taken you through these matters, is that still your evidence or not?
The answer is no, but as I previously said, when I answered that, it was to help the inquiry, and that was that generally the crown bar or the guides are kept.
Thank you.
And what I said there, so the answer is no, they weren't kept, but it was just a generalisation in an attempt to help you with the fact that I didn't think you had a lift engineer.
Thank you. Now, can I turn to a separate topic, which is Apex's involvement and what they were required to do? Now, they were the lift contractors for Project One, is that right?
Yes.
Now, did Apex ever raise any concerns with you, or indeed, to the best of your knowledge, with anyone else at the TMO, about whether the specification should provide explicitly for firefighting lifts?
No.
Did you have any conversations with anyone from Apex regarding the type of lift to be installed?
No.
Do you remember in any conversation with anyone from Apex them referring to an instruction from Mr. Steppel that firefighting lifts were not to be considered?
No.
If Butler and Young, for example, had raised any concerns, safety-related concerns regarding the lifts to be installed, would you have considered discussing making changes to the specification at that stage, or was that not for you and for Mr. Steppel?
It was completely Mr. Steppel. They wouldn't have come to me.
Now, can I turn to a separate topic, which is the fire control switch at Project One? Now, we've looked at the specification, or rather the project brief at paragraph 10.26, which required landing doors and a fireman's switch to be operated by an express anti-vandal drop key. Did you or did Mr. Steppel include that requirement in the project brief?
It would have been Mr. Steppel, but I would have advised him of that, or I would have agreed with him on that, because that's what we use borough-wide. They were supplied by Lift Components Limited. They were an anti-vandal key, whereas the Euro key, I understand, around that time you could obtain them anywhere from eBay or anywhere. So we wanted the anti-vandal key, as we have with the other 170 lifts across the borough.
Now, in his statement, Stephen Ellis said, and it's paragraph capital A, little f, and the reference is found at BUT *0004040/8, but we don't need to go to it. He said that it was considered that triangular Euro key was too available and therefore vulnerable to abuse by unauthorised persons. Does that reflect the view at the time that was taken by?
I was just saying, yes, yeah. I agree.
Were you aware of any concerns that copy express drop keys were also widely available?
No, I wasn't aware of that. They were supplied by LCL Lift Components, who were part of the express lift company who designed them, and that was the only place I thought you could obtain them from.
And you don't remember Butler and Young or Apex expressing any concerns that express drop keys were available?
No.
Now can I turn to another topic, which is testing of the fire control switch. Can you help us? How often do the lift contractors test the fire control switch?
It will be part of the service in which they carry out on a monthly basis. I'm not sure. Possibly bi-monthly. Possibly bi-monthly.
Now, it seems if we can go to possibly a planned service visit report from ILS.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, who are ILS?
Independent lift services.
Thank you. And if we go to TMO 00871287/1, this probably gives you something practical to look at.
Yeah.
Now, this looks like a planned service visit report dated the 10th of January 2011. We see that in the top right box. First of all, am I reading that right?
Yeah.
And that the inspection dates noted on the report appear to be the 11th of November 2010, 7th of December 2010, and the 10th of January 2011. Again, am I reading that right?
That's right.
Now we see on the first page, in the right-hand column, under the heading Landings, and 3 points down, the report lists fire control, and the letter S, so S for Sierra, appears to the left-hand side. Now if we de-amplify and look in the bottom left-hand corner, we see a key which is headed codes, and the S for Sierra denotes or connotes serviceable. Is that right?
That's right.
Right. Would you have seen, or first of all, would you have seen this type of report routinely?
Yes.
Now, the report there, as we've just discussed, refers to fire control. Do you know if this is a reference to the manual fire control switch operated with an express key, or is it a reference to the automatic fire recall system?
At that time, it was the manual control switch, yes.
Thank you. Now, can I turn on to a separate topic, which is testing by TMO staff? Now, was more frequent testing carried out by TMO staff on the fire control switch?
Each building had its own fire evacuation procedure, and the caretakers were given their own work schedule by each office. I actually instructed them in how to release people from lists, for instance, but that would be for the area manager to instruct their staff when to carry that out. Obviously, you couldn't keep using it. You'd cause problems with the tenants if they didn't have any lifts, so that would have to be done at a specific time when agreed with the caretakers as part of their daily or monthly routine. Or
Thank you. My question was more frequent testing. So was testing carried out by TMO staff more frequently than by the independent lift contractors?
I don't know.
In answer to the question who carried out this testing, is the answer caretakers, later known as ESAs?
Yes.
Now, BS 55885, Section 5, subsection 17.2, recommends weekly testing of the fire control switch. First of all, were you aware of that requirement?
No.
There was a separate standard which is relevant here, which is BS EN 8172, 2015, which is an update of the 2003 standards. And that says, and the reference, we don't need to go to it, is at BSI 0000824. That too states that the fire control switch should typically be checked weekly. Were you aware of the previous version of that standard having that recommendation?
No.
Did you ever consider testing the fire control switch on a weekly basis?
No.
Did anyone suggest to you that it ought to have been?
No.
Now, you say in your statement at paragraph 28, which is at TMO 008666023/3, that you would try and visit each lift every 6 months. Is that right?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, of course. You say in your statement, paragraph 28, and the reference is TMO 008666023/3. That might well be if we could put that on the screen. Paragraph 28, at the very bottom. There we go, just let you refresh your memory. You say in the second sentence on the second line, I try to visit each of the 160 lifts in the TMO portfolio every 6 months. Is that right?
I did try to, but that didn't always happen. Especially towards the last couple of years when I was the engineer with the TMO, when I was involved in other projects. And it tended to be problem run. If we had problems on lifts, then I'd go along to them. And it ended up in the end that I was the only lift engineer. So my job became more difficult to keep to that schedule.
Just for the sake of completeness, Mr. Stedman, who's an ESA at Grenfell Tower, I suspect you knew, estimated that you would visit once a month. Is it being unduly generous, or is
very
that
generous? Whilst the refurbishment was going on, we only had one lift going. Obviously, the other lift was being renewed. So that one lift was doing twice as much work, and also it'd been breaking down previously, which was the reason we were renewing them. So if I was in the area, I would keep an eye just to see how things were going and that lift was running, because I didn't want to leave the building without any lifts.
Now, during these, if I call them 6 monthly visits, what checks would you carry out to the lifts?
Just standard visual checks.
And what do you mean by
looking within the motor room to see if they've been maintained, checking the log card, looking on top of the lift, looking within the lift pit. Sometimes I'd go down the lift shaft to check the landing door equipment and so on.
What would a visual inspection tell you about the quality or regularity of maintenance?
It would tell me if the maintenance was being carried out.
Can you explain to the panel how and why?
Lift grime would accumulate within the lift shaft and the lift pit. The log card wouldn't be completed with the correct date because the engineer had to sign every visit. And just the general, the lift door operation or push buttons not lighting up. There were certain items within the lift which would point out to me, in my 40 years' experience, that the lift wasn't being serviced.
Would you check the fire control switch itself?
No, I wouldn't.
And why wouldn't you do that?
It wasn't something that I felt I needed to do because I know the estate staff were dealing with it.
And you had no reason to doubt that they weren't doing it? Is that the position?
That's right, yes.
Now, can we go to TMO 008493330? Which should be the lifts, the TMO's lift safety breakdown and trap-in policy and procedure. This dated June 2012, as you can see from the top. First of all, have you seen this before?
No.
Now, could we go to page 30? That's 30. We see there checks by staff to the lifts, two sections, caretakers and the TMO senior lift engineer. Now, looking at the latter, it says this: periodic checks are to be by the TMO lift engineer to cover safety gear, emergency alarms, emergency car lighting, lift machine room emergency lighting, etc., in accordance with statutory regulations. The above to include that all firemen's switches, where fitted, operate correctly monthly, ensure that hand winding wheel and brake release are in correct place monthly. Now, from what you're saying, you did not carry out monthly checking.
I haven't seen that, and I wouldn't have done that, no.
Did you ever have any conversation with Mr. Stepper where he said the fire control switch ought to be checked monthly?
Mr. Stepple never said that, no.
Did he say anything along? Did he ever ask you to your recollection? No. If you let me complete the question.
Sorry.
Did he ever ask you whether you were checking the fire control switch monthly or indeed on any other regular
didn't,
basis?
no.
For the sake of completeness, can I ask us to go to Mr. Howkins' report, which is at RHO quadruple 00003/181 and paragraph 463. Now, Mr. Howkins here makes the following summary of his opinion. BS 55885 1991, section 5, subsection 17.2.e, states that operational testing of the firefighting lift controls, as described in section C1, ought to be carried out annually. The procedure described in C1 is comprehensive. I've reviewed the witness statements of David Smalley and Mark Wallace, particularly paragraphs 25 to 28 and 22 to 24 respectively. In my view, the testing described in their statements matches up to parts of the procedure in C1, but it is not as comprehensive as the procedure described in C1. I've seen no other evidence suggest that on an annual basis, the full tests described in C1 were carried out. In my view, TMO should have arranged for the testing described in C1 to happen on an annual basis, and they failed to do so. First of all, were you aware of Section C1?
No,
And so presumably you were unaware of its requirements.
that's correct.
And so you were unaware, therefore, of whether, and if so, to what extent, the TMO were complying with its requirements.
That's correct, yes.
Uh,
David Smalley and Mark Wallace, I don't know those names. I think they have been later, after I'd left, I would guess. I would imagine that maybe Pedders.
Thank you. So it's just coming up to 5 to 12. The
Yes.
next topic will take more than 5 minutes. Might this be an appropriate juncture to have the break?
Yes, and perhaps we probably could limit it to 10 minutes at this stage, could we?
I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Yes. Mr. Cahalarn, we have a break during each session, and now seems like a good time to take it. I think we can probably get away with 10 minutes, unless you think you need any longer.
No, I'm fine.
Yeah. So we'll come back at 12:05, and the only thing to say to you is please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're
Okay.
out of the room.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I'd like to go with the usher. Thank you. 12:05.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, would you ask Mr. Cahalarn to come back in, please? Good. Right, Mr. Cahalarn, all ready to carry on?
Yes, I'm fine.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnair?
Thank you, sir. Can we discuss briefly the automatic fire recall system? Can you remember why was it disconnected?
I had nothing to do with any fire recall systems. I believe that was the electrical department, the TMO electrical guys.
Can you remember when it was done?
After the completion of the contract, I think, but I had no involvement with that whatsoever.
Thank you. Now, can we turn to some correspondence that passed between you and others at the TMO after the completion of Project One? And could I go in particular to an email of the 28th of February 2011, which can be found at CST *0001781. Now, there's an email dated the 28th of February. We see they're sent at 11:25, which is at the bottom of the page. The email is sent by you to Janice Ray under the heading Firefighting Evacuation Lifts. And it says this, and I quote, "As recently discussed, standards on firefighting evacuation lifts, which are not retrospect, have become a lot clearer over the last year. None of the TMO lifts are firefighting or evacuation lifts. The TMO stock do have some of the requirements, but the cost to meet the recommended standards would prevent us upgrading our lifts." Now, first of all, do you recall this conversation?
I don't, but it's clearly my email.
Now, one thing that you have consistently emphasised in your evidence is that you were concerned with servicing and maintenance.
Correct.
Now, looking at the contents of this very brief email, first of all, it would indicate that you had thought about the issue of whether lifts in the TMO stock could or should be upgraded to firefighting lifts. First of all, is that a fair summary?
I'd thought about it in that around that time, the lifts within Kensington Town Hall, they'd taken a decision to add a secondary backup, and I asked them why, and they said it was part of the firefighting lifts. And also Thames Brook Home for the Elderly in the King's Road, they'd asked me about it, and I met a member from the fire brigade, from the King's Road Fire Brigade, and after discussions about the firefighting lifts, he said the building wasn't high enough and it wasn't appropriate to be fitted in Thames Brook Old People's Home. So those were the occasions after the Grenfell Tower installation where I did know a little bit about this before I left a year later.
But looking at the first line of this email, you say standards on firefighting evacuation lifts, which are not retrospect, have become a lot clearer over the last year. That tends to suggest that you'd considered the applicable standards in some detail. Is that right or wrong?
No, I hadn't looked at them in any detail, no.
And so when you say in the next paragraph that the cost to meet the recommended standards would prevent us upgrading our lifts, that view was not based on a considered or deep reading, first of all, of the standards themselves?
That's correct.
And so you couldn't have formed an informed view of the costs that were necessary to enhance.
It would have been from looking at Thames Brook, the amount of requirements that they were looking at there, where I would have given myself some sort of idea of the cost relevant to 160 lifts throughout the borough, and there just wasn't that sort of finances available to do that at the time.
So you reached that view on the basis of one distinct building.
That was the only building.
Extrapolated to all 160 buildings in the TMO stock. Is that right?
I did, yes.
Had you sought any expert or external advice regarding the extent of the work that would be required to enhance the TMO stock of lifts?
I hadn't. If I was asked to carry out a feasibility report, I would have.
But you never were?
I never was.
Did you discuss the issue of whether, and if so, to what extent, to upgrade the lifts in the TMO stock with anyone at the TMO, such as Janice Ray?
No.
Was there ever a specific recommendation from anyone in your department that lifts in the TMO stock should be enhanced to firefighting lift status?
No.
Now, if we can de-amplify that email and stay on this page but look at Carl Stokes' response from the 28th of February. And it's addressed to Janice Ray. And he says, "Hi Janice, as far as I know, the requirements for a firefighting lift evacuation lift did not change in the March 2010 edition of Building Regs. Next time I am in the hub, could we sit down with Robin, as he might have different information than me? Does he have copies of the information he is talking about? He could forward to me. Carl." Now, first of all, did you ever have a conversation with Mr. Stokes as to the applicable standards that were required for firefighting lifts?
No.
Did you ever provide Mr. Stokes with any further information regarding the applicable standards?
Not that I can remember, no.
When you referred in your earlier email to standards on firefighting evacuation lifts having become a lot clearer, what had prompted that increased clarity over their requirements?
It wasn't clarity as such. I became more aware of it because of the two previous sites that I've already mentioned to you.
Can we look at paragraph 36 of your statement, which is at TMO 008666023/4 and paragraph 36? I'll just let you refresh your memory. Did you ever tell Mr. Stokes that the lifts at Grenfell Tower were firemen's lifts?
No.
Now, in his evidence on the 26th of May of this year, Mr. Stokes stated, and the reference, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is day 137, page 159, line 17. He said that he met you following this email at the end of February. And he was asked at that meeting, did he give you any reassurance that the lifts did, in fact, meet the requirements? And he responded, yes, and that was in the context of firefighting lifts. Do you recall that conversation with Mr.
No,
Stokes?
I don't.
Carl Stokes stated that you advised him that the lifts had, quotes, dedicated power supplies, close quotes. He stated that, and I quote, it was everything apart from virtually the lift hatch, close quotes. He also said, and I quote, I think we accepted that they met the standard of the previous document, which is dedicated power supply. Do you remember that discussion?
I didn't say that, and that's not correct.
Are you denying that that conversation ever took place?
As far as I can remember, yes.
And was there a separate dedicated power supply to
There wasn't, no.
Did you ever provide any reassurance to Carl Stokes that the lifts at Grenfell were firefighting lifts?
Not that I remember, no.
Did you ever say to him that they were firefighting lifts according to the standards at the time of installation, that's, say, 2005, 2006?
No.
Or according to the standards at the time of your conversation or the alleged conversation in 2011?
No.
Did you ever have any discussion with Mr. Stokes about upgrading the lifts at Grenfell to firefighting lift status?
No. I don't remember hardly any conversations with Mr. Stokes. He was around the office occasionally, but I never had any meetings or any sort of meetings where I would make statements like that.
Can I now turn to the topic of maintenance? Did the maintenance regime of lifts stay much the same following 2005 up until the time you retired at the end of 2012?
Yes.
How frequent were maintenance visits?
At Grenfell Tower, monthly.
And who were the lift contractors that were retained by the TMO between, say, 2005 and when you left in December 2000?
It was a year's free warranty period. So Apex for the first year, and then we had a bulk maintenance contract. Independent Lift Services took over. till when I left. My last project with the TMO was to try and get a new lift specification together, which I spent quite a lot of time on in that last year in 2012. I understand that was never completed.
Can you remember how the services of ILS were procured?
By tender.
Right. Do you remember any problems with maintenance contractors failing to, first of all, attend the regular maintenance visits?
When I first joined, Otis lifts were absolutely awful.
But dealing more
and
with
they didn't attend, and we took them off the contract.
But dealing with the period 2005 to 2012, did you have problems with ILS?
No problems whatsoever.
What tests were the maintenance contractors expected to perform when they attended?
They had a schedule of items to be checked, and they carried out PM7s, which became LG1s, gear inspections, safety gear checks, and governor checks on a 5-year and 10-year basis.
Were there any recurring or common problems reported in relation to the lifts at Grenfell?
Off the top of my head, no, but as I've already said, there was only one lift working, which was due for refurbishment because it wasn't reliable, and that was doing twice as much work. So I would imagine there would have been problems, yeah. In the end, we had to acquire a standby engineer to be available within 1 hour to fix that lift, which was an extra cost.
So to keep it going?
Yes.
Was maintenance carried out by anyone other than ILS and for the relevant yearly period apex?
Not whilst I was there.
Would it be fair to say then that, at least in your view, apex for the relevant year after installation and thereafter ILS performed their duties satisfactorily?
Yes.
How would you monitor the performance of the lift maintenance contractors?
We had monthly meetings, and at those meetings we would have breakdown logs, which we acquired from our system of orders with breakdowns. I'd also get reports back from site. Keith Stevenson was very good. He'd liaise with me, and I'd make my visits whenever I was in the area.
Were problems ever reported in relation to the fire control switch?
No.
And you're adamant about that?
Yes. What I can remember.
Thank you. Can I now turn to the question of the TMO's fire safety policy? Do you remember ever seeing the TMO's fire safety policy?
No.
Did you ever have any cause to ask to see it?
No.
Were you ever consulted about the drafting or substance of the fire safety strategy?
No.
Were you ever sought for information by Janice Ray or others who are responsible for drafting?
No.
Can we go to TMO 100 1587? I'll just let you briefly refresh on, or read it, I should say. Can you remember ever seeing that document before?
I've never seen that before, no. Excuse me.
Now, if we can go to page 10, we see at the top there's the heading Fire Safety and TMO Lifts, and it says this in part of the first paragraph. As much of the housing stock is medium and high-rise, the TMO have a large number of residential blocks which are served by one or more lifts. Not all of the criteria which define a firefighting lift are appropriate to our lifts. Specifically, for example, the requirement to have a trapdoor in the roof, the lift cart, etc., could be detrimental to the safety of our lifts. If you didn't draft that, are you able to assist the panel as to who might have drafted that?
No idea, no.
But you don't remember your advice or guidance ever being sought on these matters?
No.
Can you help us? First of all, do you agree that the requirement to have a trapdoor on the roof, the lift cart, could be detrimental to the safety of lifts?
I agree with that. Would you like me to elaborate?
Yes, please.
When I joined the lift industry in 1967, And from 67 through to the 70s, there were more incidents of youths surfing within the lift shaft, getting into the lift shaft and carrying up and down on the trailing flexes, gaining access to the top of the lift through the hatch, and subsequently, it was the LCC in those days, or pushing the hatch up and stopping the lift, which the postman used to do so no one would come and steal the lift from him. So in the end, they shut all of those hatches down throughout the LCC area and put locks on them. You couldn't climb through the hatch anyway. It was normally too small, depending on the size of the lift. And it was purely there to look down the hatch and say, OK, guys, the fire brigade are on their way. So it was not really something that anyone thought was beneficiary. Well, I'm surprised that it's now come back into the into everyone's within this system. Yeah.
Thank you. If we can go back to the fire safety strategy and the paragraph we were reading just before those questions, and it's really the last few lines which start with the words, however, TMO lift serving blocks of a height greater than 18 metres do meet a significant number of these firefighting lift criteria, and these are set out below. And then 5 particular items are set out: minimum car size, dedicated power supply, two-way communication, fireman's control switch, and lift, car and landing doors are composed of stainless steel and over 2 hours of fire resistance. Now, the strategy goes on to list the criteria of firefighting lift which was said to have been met. Now, first of all, having read this and having me take you through it, is your evidence still that you were not consulted?
I wasn't, no.
In relation to that?
We had smaller lifts than 8-person capacity lifts.
As a matter of fact, is the statement that the TMO lift serving blocks of a height greater than 18 metres do meet a significant number, as a matter of fact, would you accept that was correct or not?
Yes.
Would it be your position that to be properly classified as a firefighting lift,
No.
a lift would have to have all the features of a firefighting lift and not just some?
Yes, I agree that it should have all the features, yes.
And on what basis do you hold that view?
At this moment in time, listening to the professionals who have been given...
Well, I'm thinking at the time, was that a view held at the time, i.e. between 2005 and 2012?
because that's what we were doing throughout the borough. It wasn't something that I went into. And that was given to by the consultants and Dave Steppel. So I went along with, yes, I agreed with what they were saying. I didn't have any reason to disagree.
Would the TMO describe its lifts as firefighting lifts, even though those lifts did not have all the features of a firefighting lift?
No.
And you're adamant about that?
Yes.
And there would be no exception to that?
No.
Now, would you read this fire safety strategy as indicating that there was a tendency to use the phrase firefighting lift, even where all lifts did not possess the qualities of a firefighting lift?
I agree with that, yes.
Do you remember whether there was any, or actually what term would be used internally at the TMO when discussing lifts to describe the types of lifts that were installed? Would the phrase firefighting lift be used normally or not at all?
I wouldn't. I would call it a fireman's lift, but this looks like it's something that's drummed up when they were getting procedures together for the TMO, because it was around 2010. So I'm guessing that...
Well, this is 2012.
I'd gone by then, so I wouldn't be aware.
In your conversations with Janice Ray, did she ever use a specific description of the lifts that were in the high-rise buildings?
No.
Do you recall her using the phrase firefighting lift?
No.
Did Mr. Steppel ever use the phrase firefighting lift?
No.
Could I ask you to turn to paragraph 36 of your first statement, which is at TMO 008666023/4. I'll just let you refresh your memory of your statement there. Now, that flows on from the evidence you've just given, that you weren't aware that the TMO had its own definition of a firefighting lift, and you did not understand the reference. Now, if we could go back to the fire safety strategy, so TMO 1001587/10. Thank you. And if we could look at the very bottom of that page, it says there attached to Appendix 7 is a comprehensive list of all TMO lifts. Firefighting lifts as described above are indicated by bold type. Now, that tends to suggest that the TMO had its own definition of firefighting lifts. Would you accept that?
I can't really guess, can I?
Well, I'm not-
I would agree with you on that, but I don't know, yes.
But I don't want to
It would
summarise-
suggest that they have their own.
But in practice, and mindful of your obligations, is it right to summarise your evidence that, first of all, you're aware that none of the lifts on the TMO stock were firefighting lifts?
I agree with that.
And would it be equally right to say that you never used that phrase, firefighting lift, to describe any of them in your
wouldn't.
discussions with others at the TMO?
No, I wouldn't use it.
Was there at any time between 2005 and 2012 any confusion as to the classification of the lifts that you were that you had to clarify and resolve?
I didn't have to, no.
Could we go to TMO 1001577? Now, this appears to be another iteration of the fire safety strategy, and we think it's dated, or it is dated, October 2012. And if we can go to page 10, it says there, you see roughly below halfway, 18.2, heading firefighting lifts. The paragraph immediately under that subheading says this: as much of the housing stock is made up of medium-rise and high-rise blocks, a large number of these are served by one or more lifts. Where appropriate, firefighting lifts are provided within TMO residential blocks. This is to satisfy the requirements of the building regulations because of the height of the building, over 18 metres, etc. When the lifts are installed, they are compliant with the relevant standards current at that time. Similarly, when replacement lifts are installed, these are compliant with the standards current at the time of replacement. The criteria for TMO firefighting lifts is set out below. Now, in October 2012, as I understand your evidence, there were no firefighting lifts properly
There
called.
weren't.
Have you seen this document before?
No.
Can you remember, in the run-up to October 2012, being consulted by anyone at the TMO as to the particular type of lifts that were in the TMO stock?
No.
At this stage, was Mr. Steppel still retained by the TMO or
I
employed?
believe he left in 2010.
Other than yourself, was there anyone else at the TMO who could have been sensibly consulted as to the type of lifts that were on the TMO stock?
No, they'd have to go to an outside source, a lift consultant or a lift maintenance contractor. I believe Janice did speak to have the switch that you were talking about earlier, direct with Apex, so she did speak to the lift company. She may have spoke to lift consultants, but
But you
definitely
don't
not
know
me.
whether there was any conversation
No, I
in relation
don't.
to this?
No.
You can't assist on that point,
I can't.
because you weren't involved.
I wasn't.
Now, this version of the strategy acknowledges that firefighting lifts should be provided in buildings over 18 metres. Would you agree that that's a fair reading of what's set out in that paragraph?
Yes.
Was that your understanding at the time when you were employed by the TMO as a lift engineer?
I wouldn't have, no, I wouldn't have been involved in anything like that, no.
When the paragraph says this, when replacement lifts are installed, these are compliant with standards current at the time of replacement, that indicates that the TMO's understanding was that when lifts were replaced, those replacements had to comply with current standards, again, Would you accept that's a fair reading of that paragraph?
But that was written in 2012,
Yes.
10 years after the lifts were installed.
Yes, I'm just asking you about this document.
That document is right, yes, that's correct, yeah.
Now, following on from that answer, is the summary of principles set out here, was that the TMO's practice at the time of Project 1, i.e. in 2003, 2004?
No,
Were you ever consulted upon a change in the TMO's policy and practice between 2003, 2004 and the date of this document, October 2012?
no.
Could I go to TMO 00849330? And this is the document we considered earlier, which is the TMO's lift safety breakdown and trap-in policy and procedure, which you said you hadn't seen before. And if we could go to page 10 of this document in section 17, we see at 17.2, it says this: building regulations. All lifts, lift machine rooms and shafts are to be constructed in accordance with the latest regulations in relation to fire. Now, that also suggests that lifts should meet the contemporaneous standards for fire safety, at least at the time of their construction. Was that your understanding of the policy that TMO applied, at least in June 2012?
We didn't build any new lift shafts or new lift motor rooms in the period of time I was there. There were no new builds whatsoever.
And so you, in practical experience, you had no need to refer to that particular provision or be aware of it?
That's correct.
Now, can I ask you, finally, about the walkway switch at Grenfell Tower? Now, it appears that a second fire control switch was installed on the walkway floor of the tower. Do you know, first of all, why?
I don't know whether that was fitted. I'm not aware of that, no.
Were you aware that it had been disconnected?
No.
And finally, just a point of clarification, you left December 2012, so before the second lift project started,
Yes.
and you had no involvement in that project?
No.
Thank you. Sir, I've come to the end of my prepared questions. I'd be grateful for 10 minutes to review
Yes.
whether I've missed out anything and to see whether anyone has
Yes.
any other relevant questions to be asked.
Right. Well, Mr. Cahalarn, if you've been watching our proceedings, you'll know that at this point, when counsel thinks he's finished his questions, we have a short break
Okay.
to give him chance just to check that there's nothing he's overlooked, and to give other people who aren't here the chance to suggest questions that
Okay.
perhaps we should ask you. So we'll break now until 1:45, and then when you come back at 1:45, we'll see if there are any more questions for you.
Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you very much. I think 10 minutes will probably be enough, but if you need more time, just let the usher know.
Thanks, sir.
1:45, thank you. Would you ask Mr. Cahalarn to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Cahalarn. Well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr.
There are a
Cahalarn.
few questions, sir.
Right.
Can I ask us to go to SAL 0000042? Thank you. Now, as you see, these are minutes of a meeting on the 23rd of February 2010 to consider fire risk assessments and high-risk blocks. We can see that you attended. You're the last of the attendees identified there. Do you remember this meeting?
No.
If we look at paragraph 2.1, it says this: Robin Cahalarn, TMO lift engineer, attended for this item, that item being requirements of firefighting lifts, etc. Janice advised that a number of FRA action plans had raised specific queries in relation to lifts, and these had been referred to Robin, who was seeking confirmation from Salvus that his interpretation of what constitutes a firefighting lift is the same as theirs. Now, first of all, what queries, can you remember, were referred to you?
I've never heard of Salvus. I don't remember the meeting at all.
If we go further down, we see a box immediately below paragraph 2.1, and it says there, at point 1, it is recommended that TMO confirms if any of the lifts installed at the building are either firefighter or evacuation lifts as required by building regulations, as the building is over 18 metres high. Had you been asked to confirm if any of the lifts installed were firefighter or evacuation lifts?
No.
The minutes of the meeting indicate that you discussed the differences between different types of lift. Can you remember now whether that had in fact been discussed?
I don't recall that.
There is no reference here to consideration by you of the precise requirements of a firefighting lift. Before this meeting, can you recall whether you consulted the relevant standards?
Oh, I didn't. No, I'm not aware of the meeting. I'm not aware of Salvus, and I can't remember that at all.
Well, you would have been aware of the meeting, you just can't remember it. Is that your evidence because you attended the meeting?
I can't remember it.
Is your evidence that neither you nor, to the best of your knowledge, the TMO received any advice from Salvus regarding lifts?
That's correct.
Now, in the third line of the paragraph immediately below the box, the minutes record that you concluded that most of the borough's lifts meet the majority, but not all of the criteria which defined a firefighting lift. Had you carried out an audit or examined your records in order to come to that conclusion?
No.
So on what basis did you reach that conclusion?
I don't remember reaching that conclusion.
There is no record of you correcting these minutes. So
I don't recollect the minutes either. Do we know what date that was? Sorry, can you go back to
the
the beginning?
23rd of February 2010.
No, I was about then, but I don't remember that, no.
And we see in the action, RC, so you and JW, Janice Ray, to document the criteria that the TMO's firefighting lifts meet and advise Salvus so that this can be included in future action plans. First of all, your previous evidence was that no lifts were firefighting lifts and they were firemen's lifts. If so, can you help us as to why the phrase firefighting lifts is used here?
No, I can't.
It tends to speak to a fundamental confusion as the type of lifts that are in the TMO stock, doesn't it?
Yes.
Even though it said there that you and Janice Ray were to advise Salvus so this can be included in future action plans, is your evidence still that you have no knowledge of Salvus?
No.
Is that a no?
That's a no, sorry.
Could we go to CST 0001269, which is an email chain from the 3rd of March 2010? So 10 days or so after this meeting. And it's an email correspondence between Janice Ray and Andrew Furness, and you, together with Adrian Bowman, Russell Thompson and Lornette Pemberton, are copied in. Now, the first email in the chain is at the bottom of page 1, and it's from Janice Ray. I should say it starts at the bottom of page 1. And it says there, further to the discussion at the recent progress meeting, Robin and I have put together the following information, which relates to TMO lifts serving blocks over 18 metres in height. Now, we see at the bottom then, if we go over the page, that Janice Ray sent information regarding which firefighting lift criteria the TMO lifts satisfied. If we go over the page, if we de-amplify so we can see the entire page, do you remember helping her complete that information?
No, I was just looking on the previous. It spoke about Robin's colleague,
If you go back.
so it may have been my colleague. I don't know who my colleague was at that time.
Well,
Come on to the next page.
no, hang on. Before we
Sorry, I don't remember
Okay.
having anything to do with this.
Opening paragraph of this email, further to discussion at the recent progress meeting, Robin and I have put together the following information.
Next page. Andy, Robin's colleague is currently going through the asset register to identify the location of the lifts. So it wouldn't have been me, whoever.
In relation to that point, Mr. Cahalarn, I don't think this is that complex. Can we go back over to page 1,
Okay.
looking at the bottom of the email? Janice Ray quite clearly says that you and she had put together the following information, and set out there is, I think, 9 specific items. Do you remember providing or contributing to the provision of the information for this
I
email?
don't know.
Can you help us as to why, under the heading firefighting lifts, you never corrected Janice Ray to say these are firemen's lifts, not firefighting lifts?
No, I don't remember the email. I don't know why. I don't remember it, no.
Why didn't you?
I don't remember.
You sure about that?
I can't remember why I didn't correct it, yes.
So even though, on your evidence, all the lifts in the TMO stock were firemen's lifts, you never sought to correct Janice Ray on an important point of classification of the relevant lifts?
I don't recollect that specific email.
Well, it may be that what Janice Ray had said she would produce would be a list of the characteristics of firefighting lifts which were to be found in the TMO's lifts. And if you look through her list there, we just move on to the next page. We've got car size on first page, and then power supply, communication, control switch, landing doors, but not, I notice, escape hatch in the roof of the car. Do you remember having any discussion with Janice Ray about
Don't.
characteristics of the lifts in the TMO stock?
I don't, but what I was flagging up, the top line, it says, Andy, Robin's colleague is currently going through the asset register.
Yeah, but that's only to identify the locations, I think you'll find. That's what she says anyway.
No, I don't remember that.
All right. Thank you.
So those are all the questions that I have. Mr. Cahalarn, it just leaves me to thank you for attending to give evidence today.
Yes. Well, Mr. Cahalarn, thank you very much for coming along to give us your assistance. We've really benefited from hearing your evidence. So thank you very much indeed. And that's it. You're now free to go.
Thank you. I hope I've been of assistance.
Yes, you certainly have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kinnear. Now, do we have any other witnesses today?
No, so that concludes the evidence for today. We had made preliminary investigation to see whether tomorrow's timetable could be brought forward. Unfortunately, for logistical and other practical reasons, that was not possible.
Right.
Tomorrow we will start with Mr. Howkins, who is the expert retained by the inquiry.
Yes, good. Thank you very much. Well, in that case, we'll break there for today and we'll resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
Thanks, sir.
Good. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow.